First of all, our session was not called, contrary to popular belief, it was not called Identify Access, as the sign said. It's actually Identity and Access Management. And what we did is we set four primary objectives. And the first one we'll talk about is defining the current and future state. And here it is. There it is. So this was defining the current and future state. And as you can see here, there was a lot of debate, and you can actually read these things from left to right. So we started off kind of like it wasn't a whining session, but it was a little bit of, what's wrong with what's going on. So there were some issues that we really identified that, there's some standard platform challenges, that biometric adoption really hasn't taken place, that, CAC-PIV has a huge sunk cost and more investment, and those are some challenges. And we also had, of course, we had different alternatives to disconnected, indeterminate, and limited. Thank you. I always drop the limited. Alternatives for DIL states. So in the current state today, we need to look at alternatives to hard credentials, but really not an alternative to necessarily the credentialing, but more the form factor of the PIV CAC card. So that created some conversation. We have seen today that there is what we call constrained adoption, which is not wide, broad adoption, but very constrained, primarily due to the funding issues, interoperability issues, lack of standardization, and also, that in many cases, different agencies are looking at this slightly different. So you'll see this when we talk about frameworks and so on in a moment. But then we really started hammering what the future state was going to be. And what we came up with was this notion of contextual. The future state is very contextual in nature. That we need to look at multiple factors beyond that base level hard credential of a CAC or a PIV. So it's very contextual in nature. And in order for us to establish a contextual capability for this future state, we needed to develop contextual ecosystems. And this ecosystem would look at the different types of factors beyond just the hard credential. So things like location, biometric, time of day, and so on. So we're looking really at replacing and coming up with new contextual factors, alternative factors based on risk, and then develop a granular trust model, which has to be policy driven. You'll see this in the next slide. Policy is really the key component, the cog, if you will, in the wheel of identity and access management. That really authentication needs to be data-driven, not just individual identity-driven. And that there's a need for more than just device authentication, but really application and data authentication. Again, that brings us into derived credential, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Policy, very, very important. We are really recommending that because funding is an issue, that the government looks into the development of integration labs, incubation labs, and so on, so that we can as industry really collaborate amongst ourselves and ensure that the investments that we make in terms of interoperability and integration have a return on the investment based on the government's funding. Okay, next one. So then we looked at four different areas that we needed to identify available and emerging technologies and infrastructures, identify standards and frameworks, and outline policies regimes that help us achieve that future state of identity and access management. In the first case, derived credentials, very, very important. We understand that NIST is obviously working towards some guidance that should be out any day now for derived credentials. But however, we as a group believe that the issues of provisioning and revocation, also known as, what did we call it?
Mutable.
Immutable.
Mutable.
Mutable, yes, mutable credentials, that we do embrace provisioning, revocation, and all issues relative to derived credentials. That derivation can take place over the air. Two technologies that are very nascent, but are making some headway is near-field communication, particularly at the kernel level, so that we can identify individuals and devices at the kernel level, and continuously authenticate through heartbeating. That is very, very important to us from an identity and access management perspective, including biometrics and geospatial. Real-time revocation came up. Revocation comes up a lot. It needs to be done on a real-time basis. In fact, the whole identity life cycle needs to be done almost real-time. Then we need to obviously standardize our card management systems so that we can generate credentials at the device, application, and data level. Infrastructure issues, multimodal authentication, perhaps being enabled through MDM. We really believe that the answer that one of the ways that mobile IAM is going to be, the future state is going to be enabled, is through cloud-based identity and access management. And that means, again, more ecosystem support for all four areas relative to identity and access management, whether authentication, authorization, administration, or auditing. All of those need ecosystems behind them to get us to that state. So we need to bind the credentials to various factors, and that implies a level of federation. So again, based on cloud-based identity and access management, we can enable federation. We mentioned FedRAMP in quotes, not necessarily saying that we need new policy, new approval frameworks for these infrastructures, but something similar to that. And to that extent, looking at leveraging existing standards such as IDEN and NGI, and looking at how, for example, the National Strategy for Trusted Identity in Cyberspace is looking at it from a very, very broad perspective. Finally, the most important area, and that had to do with policy. Things like credentialing policy, risk policies, establishing a common denominator. This was debated a little bit in our group, in that as we federate and we have multimodal levels of authentication, we need to establish that common denominator from which we build other factors. And that we basically said we use what we've got, and that's the credential itself, whether hard or soft or derived. And then that means a lot of interop, which gets us back to federation, and the cycle continues to turn.
No, that was great. That was good stuff. So with that, any questions from the audience?
Yeah.
It's got to be one question. No. I do have a question for you.
Sure.
So getting back to the context-aware piece, I know under the tech here you have a few different types of sensors like biometrics, but were there any other sensor types discussed?
Yeah, we talked a little bit about, for example, one factor that we talked about was locationing, where an individual is can determine what levels of privilege that individual has, and that can also be a factor that is combined with other factors to establish a level of risk from which an individual's authorization and privileges and therefore access control is derived.
Great.
Did you guys talk at all about data payloads and how data would drive credential?
We didn't get to that level. You mean like encrypting payloads and that kind of thing, or the type of data?
Right, so I mean, if the information that you're trying to open on the mobile device might actually require a different authentication level.
Yes, we did. We talked about the application level as one of the many contextual factors.
But what about the data?
So that could be either the container on the device, the data on the device, or that could also extend from an access control perspective all the way to a database, or in fact a data center.
So, and not just the data at that point, but other actions that you take. And so,
me accessing one account might raise the type of credentialing you do if I try to access data on another account, even though they were both the same type of data, maybe even for the same entity. And then that kind of gets into some of the other, contextual things, such as, if I try to access data on two accounts, maybe I need a second person there with me to verify, some level of trust, or we get into some of the, beyond just biometrics from who I am, but like, what's my current state? Is my heart rate going? Am I sweating? Is my temperature up? Things like that. So, but that kind of got back to Don's point around the ecosystem of allowing new technologies to emerge without sort of invalidating, the entire paradigm, and something that might be relevant to one, organization may not be relevant to another.
And of course, the speed of adoption is critical here, so that if a new factor was introduced, that it can be embraced very, very quickly.
Right.
It doesn't have to go through a long, laborious effort, because of course, the more factors you've got, the more complexity you introduce. So we need to find a way to embrace those factors very quickly and test them in integration labs and so on.
The reason I was asking is with most grade crypto on most devices at 256 now, there's a lot of conversation going on about upping the commercial mobile device to secret mode.
Mm-hmm.
So I can easily see data payloads actually defining
Absolutely.
different.
Absolutely. And the
Even
question,
before they get to the device,
Mhm.
right?
just in the air.